Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today, I bring you a video about the real life of Hùng and Hoài Ca, a story that is deeply human, painfully close to reality, and as fragile as the moments any family might one day experience. It was still dark. Night continued to blanket the small house, so quiet that the soft ticking of the clock could be heard marking each slow second. The morning light had not yet slipped through the thin white curtains in the bedroom, leaving only a dim blur between night and dawn. In that space, Hoài Ca suddenly woke up. Not because of a noise, nor a vivid dream, but because of a heavy feeling she couldn't quite name, as if something was wrong, quietly unfolding. Her heart beat faster than usual, each thud echoing in her chest, forcing her to place a hand over her heart and take a deep breath. In the near-total silence, Hoài Ca heard a strange sound. It was uneven, labored breathing, shallow and rushed, coming from the small bed beside hers. The sound wasn't loud, but in the stillness of early morning, it felt painfully clear. Hoài Ca turned her body, her gaze immediately settling on the small figure curled tightly beneath the blanket. Anna, the daughter she shared with Hùng, lay there, her little body drawn inward, hands clutching the edge of the blanket as if searching for something to hold onto. Her face was flushed in an unusual way, her skin taut and glowing faintly under the dim light in the room. Her lips were dry, slightly parted with each hot, shallow breath. Hoài Ca gently placed her hand on her daughter's forehead. It was just a light touch, but the heat that rushed into her palm made her heart clench, a cold chill running straight down her spine. She leaned closer and whispered Anna's name, but the child only stirred slightly, never opening her eyes. Her breathing remained fast and heavy, as though each breath demanded immense effort. Hoài Ca turned toward Hùng, her voice trembling despite herself. On Hùng. Hùng jolted awake, nearly sitting upright at once. One glance at Hoài Ca's face and Anna's condition was enough for him to understand something was terribly wrong. Without a word, he placed his hand on their daughter's forehead. The heat made him frown instinctively. He looked at Hoài Ca and tightened his grip on her hand, a reflex meant both to steady his wife and to keep himself calm. Anna had a very high fever. They carried her to the sofa in the living room. The light was switched on, revealing the exhaustion etched across the child's small face. Hùng took the thermometer while Hoài Ca sat close, holding Anna's hand. The wait for the number to appear felt longer than usual. When the screen lit up with 39.8 degrees Celsius, both of them froze. It was a dangerously high fever for a child just over 4 years old. Hoài Ca stood up in a rush, searching through the medicine cabinet. Her hands shook so badly that she dropped the box of medicine onto the floor, pills rolling away, but she didn't stop to pick them up. Hùng soaked a towel in warm water and gently wiped Anna's forehead, neck, arms, and legs. Every movement was slow and cautious, as if even the slightest pressure might cause her discomfort. Anna was too weak to cry, too tired to fuss. Her small hands lay limp with each movement, her eyelids half closed, her unfocused gaze drifting as if she were slipping into a long, uncertain haze. Hoài Ca sat beside her, never taking her eyes off her daughter. Her heart was filled with unspoken fears and worries. All she could do was hold tightly onto that tiny hand, waiting, watching, hoping for even the smallest sign of change. In the corner of the living room, where the light didn't fully reach, Tony stood tucked behind the wooden door. His small body nearly blended into the shadows, with only his wide, round eyes catching the faint glow as they followed every movement of the adults. Tony was still too young to understand what was happening. He couldn't yet say his sister's name clearly, nor could he ask why the entire house had suddenly become so tense. But through a purely instinctive feeling, He sensed that something was wrong. The little boy clung tightly to the hem of Hoài Ca's shirt, his tiny fingers gripping it as if letting go might cause his mother to disappear. His gaze never left Anna, who lay on the sofa, her face flushed, her small body rising and falling with each labored breath. From time to time, Tony lifted his hand and pointed toward his sister, letting out a few soft, broken sounds, incoherent, unfinished. They weren't words or questions, just the innocent response of a child who could feel the worry filling the room. Hoài Ca bent down, one hand still holding Anna while the other gently stroked Tony's hair. She pulled her son into her arms, letting him lean against her in a quiet attempt to comfort him. That embrace held Tony close, but it also shielded her, if only slightly, from the fear that was slowly tightening its grip around her heart. Even so, her eyes never left Anna, not for a single second. Every thought, every fear she carried in that moment was fixed on her feverish little girl lying on the sofa. After taking the fever medicine, Anna was laid more carefully into a proper position. Hung and Hoài Ca took turns wiping her down, repeating the same motions over and over with endless patience. Warm towels were replaced again and again, pressed to her forehead, her neck, her tiny arms. Each time they called her name, they leaned in close, listening to every breath, waiting for even the smallest response. The room sank into a heavy silence, broken only by Anna's strained breathing and Hoài Ca's soft whispers as she kept calling her daughter's name. Time passed unbearably slowly. 1 hour, then 2. The clock continued to tick, but the fever refused to go down. Anna's forehead remained burning hot, seeming to rise rather than ease. Hoài Ca touched her daughter's skin again and again, her heart tightening with every contact. She began counting time in her head, wondering if the medicine had had enough time to work, if there was something more she should be doing. Anna's breathing grew faster. Her chest rose and fell more visibly, each breath shorter and heavier than the last. Her lips, already dry, slowly lost their color, the earlier flush fading into a frightening pallor. Her small body burned with heat, sweat breaking out but offering no relief. When Anna began to drift, her eyes closing, her responses slowing to her mother's voice, Hoài Ca could no longer keep herself together. Tears fell onto her daughter's face, hot and uncontrollable. She called Anna's name without thinking, her voice breaking, trembling, tangled with sobs she couldn't hold back. In her arms, Tony flinched softly and reached out to touch Hoài Ca's hand, as if trying to hold on to her, even though he didn't fully understand what was happening. Hung stood right beside them. He looked at his daughter, then turned to Hoài Ca as she cried. The man who always tried to remain calm now showed the strain clearly on his face. His eyes moved quickly from Anna to the thermometer to the warm towels that had begun to cool. He didn't need another second to think. There was no discussion, no hesitation. Hospital. The single word cut through the heavy silence of the room, a decision made on instinct, at the moment when every emotion had been pushed to its breaking point. The drive from their home to the hospital took less than 10 minutes, a familiar route they had traveled countless times before. Yet in that darkness, every stretch of road seemed to lengthen endlessly, as if the car were moving through a space with no destination in sight. Streetlights slid past the windows in blurred streaks of light, flickering in rhythm with the car as it sped forward in urgency. Hung sat in the back seat, holding Anna tightly against his chest. Her small body lay limp in his arms, pressed close to him. Her breathing was still rapid and hot, each short breath brushing against his neck. He wrapped his arms around her as firmly as he could, afraid that even the slightest looseness might cause her to slip away from him. His face hovered close to hers, his eyes never leaving Anna's paling features, his mind repeating a single thought over and over. They had to reach the hospital as fast as possible. Hoài Ca sat beside him. One hand gripped Hung's arm, while the other gently stroked Anna's hair, the same motion repeated again and again without thought. She kept calling her daughter's name, her voice hoarse from fear and from the tears she had already shed. At times, she leaned down close to Anna's ear, whispering the softest words, meant perhaps only for herself, hoping that Anna could still feel her mother's warmth. In the back, Hung's mother held Tony in her arms. The little boy didn't cry or protest. That silence made the adults' hearts ache even more. Tony pressed his head into his grandmother's shoulder, his small hands clutching at her clothes, his eyes wide open as he peered past her shoulder toward Anna. Though he couldn't fully understand what was happening, he could sense the tension, the fear that hung over everyone in the car. The car stopped at the hospital entrance. Everything happened so quickly that Hoài Ca could barely remember how she stepped out of the car. Anna was placed onto a stretcher and rushed into the emergency unit. Bright white lights shone down harshly, the sound of wheels rolling across the tiled floor echoing sharply in the air. Hoài Ca followed for a few steps, then stopped abruptly when a nurse signaled her to wait. The emergency room door closed. The soft click of the door sounded deafening to Hoài Ca and Hung, like a heavy slam echoing in their ears. They stood motionless outside, neither able to say a word. Hung gripped Hoài Ca's hand tightly, the pressure so strong that both could feel the other trembling. Hoài Ca leaned against him, her legs weak, struggling just to remain standing. The hospital corridor was long and cold. White lights stretched endlessly overhead, leaving no shadows to hide in and no warmth to soothe the fear tightening around their hearts. Time began to slow, each second stretching, every minute painfully distinct. Hung's mother hurried over after parking the car. Before she could even catch her breath, she reached for Hoài Ca's hand, her thin fingers trembling. She didn't ask many questions, her eyes fixed on the closed emergency room door, then returned to Hoài Ca, filled with worry. The unspoken questions seemed stuck in everyone's throats, none of them daring to voice the worst possibilities. Tony was seated on a long bench in the hallway, leaning against his grandmother. His eyelids drooped with sleep, but at every hurried footstep or the sound of a door opening, he startled awake, lifting his head to look toward the emergency room with wide, confused eyes. He didn't cry, he simply watched, quietly waiting for something he couldn't yet name. Time continued to pass in the heavy stillness of waiting. Hoài Ca sank onto the bench, her hands clasped tightly together, her head bowed low. Hung stood beside her, one hand resting on her shoulder, as if to remind her that he was still there. No words were exchanged, but both of them were counting every second in their hearts. Finally, the emergency room door opened. A doctor stepped out and removed his mask. That single movement was enough to make both Hung and Hoài Ca rise to their feet almost at the same time. Hoài Ca's heart pounded so fiercely she felt she could hardly breathe. "She has a severe infection," the doctor said, his voice calm and steady. "We're working to bring the fever down and we'll be monitoring her closely." Before the sentence was even finished, Hoài Ca's legs gave way. She nearly collapsed, only staying upright by clutching Hung's arm. He wrapped his arms around her to support her, though he himself was trembling. His hand pressed more tightly against her back, as if they were holding on to each other to keep from breaking apart right there, in that cold hospital corridor. It wasn't until late at night that the door to the hospital room finally opened, allowing them to step inside. The space was much quieter than the emergency ward earlier. The lighting was soft, and the faint scent of antiseptic lingered in the air. Anna lay on the small bed, her body neatly tucked beneath a white blanket. An 4 needle was fixed to her tiny arm, clear fluid dripping slowly, rhythmically. Her skin was paler than before, but her chest rose and fell evenly, her breathing no longer as labored. Hoài Ca stood still at the foot of the bed, her eyes never leaving her daughter. She reached out and lightly touched Anna's small hand, afraid that even the slightest pressure might cause discomfort. The hand was still warm, though no longer burning hot. That single detail was enough to ease her chest just a little, even though the worry had not fully faded. Hung pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down. He leaned forward, studying his daughter's face, every familiar feature now appearing strangely fragile. Fatigue from the long, tense night was clear in his eyes, yet they remained sharply focused, as if looking away for even a second might cause him to miss something important. The night passed slowly. Hung and Hoài Ca took turns staying awake. When exhaustion finally overcame Hoài Ca and her head leaned against the bed rail as she drifted off, Hung quietly stood up and draped his jacket over her shoulders. He adjusted her position so she could rest more comfortably, then returned to his seat, his gaze once again fixed on Anna. In that silence, he did nothing but watch his daughter's breathing, listening to the steady, mechanical sounds filling the room. When it was Hung's turn to doze off, Hoài Ca woke. She sat up straight and instinctively placed her hand on Anna's forehead. There was no need to check the temperature, the familiar warmth was enough. She kept her hand there a few seconds longer than necessary, as if to reassure herself that Anna was truly there, that everything that had happened was not just a nightmare. Neither of them spoke. The silence between them was not emptiness, but a quiet understanding. No promises were needed, no words had to be spoken. They both knew no matter what came next, they would stay right there, beside their child, without leaving her side. As the sky outside the window began to brighten, early morning sunlight slipped through the thin curtains, casting a pale golden glow across the hospital room. The space felt less cold, gently warmed by a fragile sense of hope. Anna stirred. It was only a small movement, but it immediately caught both Hoài Ca's and Hung's attention. Anna's eyes slowly opened. At first, her gaze was unfocused, as though she hadn't yet realized where she was. Hoài Ca leaned in close, calling her daughter's name in a trembling voice. When Anna's eyes finally focused, and she saw her parents' faces right in front of her, Hoài Ca could no longer hold back. Tears spilled over, falling onto her daughter's hand. Hung wrapped his arms around both of them, holding them tightly. Anna smiled weakly, a very faint smile, barely a curve at the corners of her lips. She lifted her hand and touched Hoài Ca's cheek, then Hung's, an instinctive gesture, as if she wanted to say something, but didn't yet have the strength to form the words. The doctor entered the room, his voice calm and clear, informing them that the fever had subsided, Anna's condition had stabilized, and she was out of danger. Hoài Ca and Hung listened to every word, still standing close to their daughter's bed, their eyes never leaving Anna, as if as long as they could see her there, everything else could fade into the background. In the afternoon, gentler sunlight streamed through the small window of the hospital room, casting pale patches of light across the tiled floor. The atmosphere was no longer as heavy as it had been the night before, though it still carried the quiet, unmistakable stillness of a hospital. Anna was propped up with an extra pillow. In front of her sat a bowl of thin porridge, still lightly steaming. Hoài Ca sat close to the bed, carefully scooping small spoonfuls and bringing them to her daughter's lips, slow and patient. Anna ate very slowly. Each spoonful required a brief pause, as if she needed time to regain her breath and strength. But the simple fact that her daughter was willing to open her mouth and swallow was enough to soften Hoài Ca's heart. She fed Anna while softly calling her name, her voice gentler now, worn thin after a night that had nearly drained her of emotion. When Anna managed a few spoonfuls, Hung turned and gestured to his mother. Tony was brought closer to the bed. The little boy was fully awake now, his round eyes fixed on his sister. He didn't understand why she had to lie on the tall bed, or what the tubes and needles were for. But he could sense that she was different from the morning, no longer lost in a fevered haze. Tony tilted his head as he looked at Anna, then suddenly broke into an innocent smile. He lifted his small hand and very gently touched his sister's hand, clumsy yet careful, as if afraid of hurting her. His tiny hand lingered for a moment before he turned to look at Hoài Ca. His eyes shone with clear expectation, silently asking if he had done the right thing, if he deserved praise. Hoài Ca bent down, smiled at her son, and nodded ever so slightly. That small response was enough to make Tony beam with pride. He turned back to Anna and stayed close to the bed, unwilling to move away. In that moment, the hospital room felt much warmer, not because of the sunlight outside, but because of the children's quiet presence beside each other. Hung's mother stood behind them, silently watching it all. She said nothing, only quickly wiped at the corner of her eyes when she saw Tony touch his sister's hand. These tears were no longer born of panic or fear like the night before, but of the release that followed a long, exhausting night of tension. She turned her face slightly away, as if not wanting anyone to notice. Hung stood at the foot of the bed, taking in the entire scene before him. Hoài Ca sat beside Anna, her face still tired, but her eyes no longer filled with panic. Tony stood close, his hand resting on his sister's. His mother remained quietly in the background. It was a simple picture, imperfect, lacking by any standard, yet it caused something deep within him to settle in a way he hadn't expected. For the first time since the long, harrowing night, Hung truly let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He said nothing, only allowed a small smile to form. It wasn't wide or showy, but a quiet relief spreading from within, the kind that comes when you know that, at least in this moment, your family is still here together. In that modest hospital room, surrounded by the scent of antiseptic and the fading light of afternoon, Hung understood something simple yet sacred. It wasn't the successes outside, nor the grand ambitions he had once chased, but the people standing before him in that moment who were the most precious thing in his life. Family, the place that brings the deepest fear at the thought of losing it, and the deepest peace when it remains whole. Subscribe to the channel to continue following the real life of Hoài Ca and Hung.